Hello, YouTubers. This is another session in our series building end-to-end Blazor application at an enterprise level. And in the past sessions, a couple of sessions, I had a little pairing session with my friend Milan, and we built a grid where we are able to render all teachers in a particular API. But in this session, I'm going to continue and add on top of the existing submitting a student, or registering a student through an API because there's still a lot of stuff there to talk about. And this is a really important topic because dialogues and forms and being able to process data through these forms and run the validations and all that kind of good stuff is super important. Almost one of the most, other than grids, it's one of the most redundant things that you might run into. It's very likely if you're building any application of any kind, you're going to run into a place where you need to fill in some data in a form and submit that data through the system. Now, you have to understand, this is not just about Blazor. I'm trying to walk you through an end-to-end framework that starts from an idea and turns into a model, and that model turns into data, and the data goes through the API, and now you're working with a Blazor client-side application that actually can, sorry, server-side application that can actually process that data and communicate and gives you the control, in a consistent manner to actually be able to kind of work with that data and validation issues, handling the exceptions, a real, solid industrial kind of mindset when it comes to building your software, especially web applications. Okay, so let's start with the theory. We always need to talk a little bit about a theory, talk about how things work, and then we jump over to, actually implementing that. So let me share my screen here real quick. All right, here we go. So, for those of you, who never, watched any of my videos, we'll talk real quick about what we do with exception handling, right? When you are submitting a form and you're getting an exception, you're getting an error, maybe a validation error, maybe the student date of birth is not within a range or whatever the case may be, assume that your Blazor application, assume that, let's say that this realm here, this little realm here is your Blazor application. And at the broker level, you're communicating with an API. So this is your API right here. Oops. API right here. And this API is basically going and processing your request, and you're getting that request back, and it's responding to your application. And then you have a broker. This is your API broker, and then you have a service in here, and then you have a view service sitting right here. And this view service is the point of contact between your application and your component. Okay, so this is your component. This is your UI component sitting right here. So this here is UI component. And your UI component is sitting right here trying to process that data. So the trigger happens from the UI component. It hits the view service, it hits the service, hits the broker, and then it goes to call the API and so on and so forth. Okay. Now, the happy path were already something we talked about, right? We went and said, okay, I have a form and I want to submit a student. I want to make sure that my data is coming through. No problem there. But then there's the not so happy path, where an exception might occur. The exception might be happening locally from a service. Like this here, we can call this a local exception. And it actually originated at the service level. Or an exception could also come from the API all the way down here. So this is here external exception, a validation exception like an HTTP bad request. Your API is sending a bad request and it's saying, hey, your request is something is wrong with it. We can't process it. That's the API is the HTTP way of communicating something went wrong with your system. Let me hide the camera here so you can see the whole board. There you go. So this is that guy right here. And let's hide these guys. Let me just give you a little bit of ability to kind of zoom in and see everything. Okay. So this guy here is throwing a bad request, for instance, right? And the bad request goes all the way down to the broker. The broker is using something like RESTful Sense. RESTful Sense, takes that bad request and turn it into HTTP response bad request exception. So that's the beauty of that library. It's basically taking that bad request and it's turning it into an HTTP bad request, and something that C# developers can handle without having to dig a little bit deeper into what the code is and all that kind of stuff. Okay, and then eventually, if you're doing things right, this exception here will turn into to become localized exception, right? And we talked in another session about something called problem details, where all the little details, the report that's coming from the API about all the issues that are happening in your system are being rendered straight, added straight into your exception. So this is your local exception. And then on your local exception, like we always do, we wrap that local exception with a categorized exception. So this local exception is living within, let me send that guy in the back like this. So that guy living within a categorized exception. I'm going to give that guy a different color so you just know that these are two different things. Okay. And then this exception moves forward. This categorized exception will move forward into another service, and the service will do something like the view service will do the wrapping and unwrapping, right? So it will go here and say this is category exception, right? So this service will take that inner exception as is and then unwrap that existing exception. Some people ask me, then why don't you just propagate that exception upstream? And the reason for that is, if you want to kind of treat a whole bunch of different categories of exceptions within one treatment, you have to follow that particular pattern and you have to stay consistent with it. You see that a lot with brokers, with controllers, when we go and say, okay, every bad request, regardless what's within that bad request, just return 400, right? I don't care about the code that you're going to be returning from that, or an internal server error exception. Okay, so let me just add here a little title here that says this is a categorical exception. So this is a category exception, like this, and this other guy is also categorical exception. So let me take that copy of this guy here and let me paste that guy here and let me put it right there. There you go. Okay, categorical exceptions. And then at the end of the path here, we want these exceptions. You see how these guys communicated bad request? We want to spit out on the UI side something called a validation summary, which is a completely different nature of the exception. So this is a bad request coming in. It gets translated all the way to become a validation summary. And what a validation summary is, my friend, is that, whatever errors your API is throwing, whatever errors that are happening in here, they get translated into UI component that actually renders that in a language your end user can understand, right? So this is our whole journey here. From the second your API starts to throw an exception, or return an HTTP erroneous, 4xx or 5xx code, all the way down to a validation summary. Now, most of these things I'm gonna mark in green are things we've killed. We talked about so many times. So all of these things here that I'm marking in here, all of these things are things that we've talked about. More than happy to answer your questions on any of that. But the missing part of this equation is this guy right here. This guy that I'm marking in red right here. Like even the components, we talked about the components, but we never talked about a validation summary. And how do you render a validation summary? You'll see a lot of people today will tell you something like, oh, why don't you just use, what do you call it, fluent validations, right? See, it's amazing to use these things if you're building a small demo just to, show people how a particular library works. But in the enterprise world, things don't work that way, right? You could be calling 5 or 6 different APIs, and you want to collect all the errors that are coming from these APIs, kind of orchestration, and you want to combine that with any additional errors that the client wants to add, so you can actually give a real report. Okay, so that doesn't work. Like this fluent validation, idea is not going to work. If assuming that this is your client and maybe you're calling, let's say, a gatekeeper in a microservices architecture, and you have a bunch of services sitting behind that gatekeeper, and it's kind of communicating an asynchronous request across all of them, and each one of them is giving you a particular set of errors, you can't just go and say, I want to use a fluent validation, because fluent validation might be great for maybe logical and what do you call it? Logical and structural validations, but it's not going to play very well for your external validations, especially when you need that level of control to be able to know where things are coming from and where they're headed. Less magic in your work that you do, especially when you're building something scalable, is better because it's going to help you control at the end of the road if you're building custom software, and that's why they call it custom software, because the customization level is the real risk of you actually using something outside of the box. So you have to really understand how things work. If you're going to use something outside of the box, in a custom software, you better understand how it works end to end, and it better be customizable in and of itself so you can actually mold it and adjust it to fit your project. Okay, so let's go back to this guy. This is here the image that I want you to kind of burn in your memory. What Hassan is talking about today is that these exceptions that are coming, these requests that are coming from the outside world, they turn into localized exceptions. We put them in a categorical exception, we unwrap and then wrap again, and then we push that out as a validation summary. Let's start from here, just as a measure of a just assurance. Let's make sure our APIs actually work. So here's OSSS API, huge project, amazing work being done in here. I'm just gonna make sure that I have the latest and greatest on this project. Here we go. And then just for my own assurance as well, I want to make sure that all my APIs are functional. And that's the beauty of acceptance tests, right? Acceptance tests will tell you, hey, let me run a quick test on all of these endpoints that you have. I think we have like 100 or something, 103 endpoint, 103 tests, endpoints, and all of them will give me that assurance on 103 endpoints in like about a minute because it's actually running end-to-end communication. There you go. Assignments are good, assignments attachments good, calendar entries, all the kind of entities you may expect to see in a school platform. So here we go. Exam fees, exams, fees, attachments, guardian contracts. There we go. Okay, while this guy is going, on the other end of this, while this guy is running the test, I'm gonna go back here to the portal side, and I want to make sure that everything here also works end to end. So let me kind of sync up things. Here we go. And if I go and run everything, we have about 47 tests there. I'm going to start creating some issues early 2022, this upcoming year, to kind of start doing all the things that we need to kind of create entries in that system. So this is going to be end-to-end communication. It'll help people like, you have 120 entities or 120 endpoints. We want to integrate all of that on the UI side. Okay, so this is all good. This is running perfectly fine. Okay, now let me just make sure that I also have the right configuration here. I don't know if that's the right endpoint, but let's just go back to our API here real quick. Yep, and my API is done, 103 endpoints, functional, perfectly functional. Let me run this guy real quick here. And let me just show you, let's start from the API. Let's cause trouble, right? Let's go there in the API and say, I'm not going to submit anything, what are you going to do about it? And let's see what this error detail report comes in. This is the standardized way of actually getting errors from an API. So I'm going to go find students. Students, is it /API/students? There it is. So I'm going to post a student in here. So here's our Swagger in here. And I'm gonna try this out. I'm gonna literally like almost just delete everything except for the ID. Let's take all of that. Ooh, that's just too much. Okay, here we go. Yep, so I'm just keeping the ID here and I'm just gonna execute. So ideally my API should respond back with an error detail report. So it's a 400 and it's giving me the link. This is what RESTful Sense is doing for your API. It's going and saying, here's the issues that came from your exception. And here's the error details regarding every single every single piece of information. Now notice sometimes one field will have two issues in it, two different issues, right? So this is what this error detail is. You can read more about error detail if you just go into error details for API standardization, API RESTful APIs. Yeah, you'll see this everywhere. Google, Microsoft, Amazon, everywhere. They will talk about the error details, and this, I think this is the standardization. Yeah, they'll talk about error details in here. You know, you can look through that and see what's going on there. But that's basically the standard or the reference for you to go and understand the error details that come from an API. So this is a standardized way. If your API doesn't return a report about the issues in the request, something is definitely wrong in the implementation. Okay, so the API is functional. Now let's go run the UI. Let's go back to our UI piece here, and let's run that guy. So I'm gonna go here and see if the index. I remember last time Milan and I kind of, put the yeah, okay. So we have the student registration component. Okay, let's run this guy. So we're gonna try to submit a student basically. Here we go, and I'm just gonna go here and say, okay, here's a bunch of things, bunch of things, bunch of things, and then just adding some data here, and I'm just going and saying submit. So technically this guy should say student submitted or something like that through the API, unless I'm talking to the wrong API endpoint. I'm probably talking to the wrong API endpoint. Let's see here what endpoint. It's 5001. All right, let's go to the portal here. Let me pick up this guy and say 5001. 5001. There you go. So it's just the configuration that tells my Blazor application which endpoint it needs to talk to in order for it to achieve a successful communication with the API. All right, let's try this again. So here we go. So in this area here, I can go here and say here's a bunch of details. Actually, let me add something proper. Okay, APC123. That's definitely proper than the nonsense, right? So this is M, and then this is Habib, and this is mail, and I'm just gonna put whatever in there, and then I'm gonna submit. So here you go, and then it says student submitted successfully. Okay, so that means if I go back to my API here and I say retrieve all students, I should see my name there. So let's get all students right here, and I'm gonna go and try it out, and I'm just gonna click execute, and it's gonna bring me back whatever. There it is. That's the record I just entered right here. Okay, so far so good. The API is working, happy path, end to end is great, right? Now here comes the problem. When an issue occurs, when there's a problem, like if I go back to my UI here and I leave all of these empty or some of them and I click submit, it will say invalid student error occurred. Please fix the errors and try again. But it doesn't really tell me what happened, like where is the error, right? I want to fix this form. Maybe my student identity is right. Maybe my first name is right. So it really, really helps to have this validation summary, which tells you exactly what's going on with your fields, right? So let's start with that. First of all, we need something called, let's go back to the Blackboard real quick and tell you what we're going to do first. Okay, here's a Blackboard. So assume that you have a form like this very form that we just looked at. And then you have all these fields. There's so many different ways that you can display issues in your system, right? Some people go and say, oh, just display all the errors in one place. So some people will go and say, oh, this field is bad, and this field is bad, and this field is bad. Let me go and display all the errors in one report at the very bottom like this and tell the end users what's wrong with their data, right? You could do that, right? And some other people will go and say, no, that's really ugly. Let's display it right under each and every field. So if your student name is bad, we're going to say student name is bad. If there's multiple errors under each and every one of them, especially if the form is larger, it has like some 30, 40 fields, I wouldn't know why you would do that to your end users. There's this thing called forms that you can switch over, like a bunch of screens. But if you choose to go that route, for God knows why, this would be a lot more helpful than adding a report at the very bottom, because that means people are going to have to go back and forth to see what's going on. And some people say, nope, I don't want to do any of that. I'm going to display what I call a toast. A little toast at the top here, like a little error message, right, of a certain, warning color like this. And then inside that message, you can go and say, oh, here's a problem that happened in the system right here. Right? And this problem here is what occurred, and this is what you need to do about it, and that's that. So there's all different kinds of ways you can actually display an error message. There are people that even say, nope, I'm going to block you completely. This is horrible. Don't do that. I'm going to block you completely and display a dialog with a button that says OK. I don't know why error dialog says OK. It's not OK. Something happened, but they'll go and say OK. And then they display the error right here. So there's all these kind of different tricks that people will do to display an error message. But at the end of the day, we agree that an error message needs to happen to tell the end user how to fix the issues that happened in their system. And these issues might have been occurring from the client itself or from a far, far away API that we're communicating with, and we're just trying to transcend these error details all the way up to that UI component. So how are we going to do this? How are we going to accomplish this, right? Let's first go and start to build a simple base component. So these errors here, we need a simple base component. So a little base component here that I call validation summary base. Not to be confused with the native outside of the box Blazor capability that is called validation summary. That's different. It works even differently. This one is something that we're going to build by hand from scratch, and we're going to test drive it as we should do our software, and we're going to validate that it actually has the right errors passed into it, at the right place at the right time. So this validation summary base, let's go back into our OSSS portal here. Here's our code. And let's start that. Here's a new branch. Users, Hassan Habib, bases, right? Validation summary components. So okay, so that's my guy. And then I'm going to go down here in the bases area, and I'm going to go and create a new Razor component, and I'm going to call it validation summary base. So this is a base component that I'm building here. And this base component here will basically, so this is your validation summary base. And this base component, I want it to just, we're going to build something like really basic, like something from scratch, and then we're going to make it pretty, and we're going to make it really, really production ready. So I need some code behind this validation summary base. Well, what is incoming to me? Well, I know that I'm going to get a dictionary of data. That's what this exception is carrying. It's carrying a dictionary of data. And this dictionary of data is going to basically contain a key value pair. And the key is just a string, and the value is just a list of errors that are coming from that exception. Right? So just key value pair. And you're picking up that key value pair, and you're just placing it in the proper location. That's really all that we're doing. So I need a C# file in here. And this C# file will take that dictionary. What is the type of the dictionary that the exceptions are throwing? Let's just do this validation summary base.razor.cs. It's the exception gives you back a type I dictionary, right? So this I dictionary here is where the magic happens. Let's just go here, and it's partial like this. And then I'm going to do parameter. Okay, so I'm getting a prop I dictionary because that's the type that's coming from your inner exception data. And I'm going to call it validation data. Okay, so that's one. The second one I want to pass here is also another parameter. And this parameter is going to be just the key. And that key tells me where in this validation data I need to look for details. Okay, so when an exception occurs, like if I put a breakpoint on my API here, let me show you what this looks like really. If this is your controller in here, and let's say this is your student's controller, and we are at the submit student, post student, so we are capturing student validation exception, which is this guy. So if I put a breakpoint on this guy here, and I go hit the Swagger again, like this, execute, this guy is gonna throw the exception. If you look inside that exception, you're gonna find something interesting. Let me do the quick view here. Uh, let's see. I need the whole thing. Okay, let's do the whole thing. So inside that exception here, you see something here called data, right? Of type iDictionary. No surprise there because that's really the model that we're working with. Do you see that iDictionary in here? That's coming from the exception. And then if you open up that guy, you will find in the results view, you will find entries. And every entry has a key, which is the property name, and then has a list of errors. Remember how the created date had two issues in it? Here, a list that has date required, date is not recent on the created date. So the dictionary that's coming back it's really a dictionary of a string, list string, or IEnumerable string, because sometimes it's an array, sometimes it's a list. I need to fix that part. But ideally, they're all IEnumerable, and they're coming to you to be rendered on the screen, and you need to kind of handle that. Okay, let's go back to our. So this is the validation data. This is where the dictionary of data is going to come from. So it's going to travel all the way from the API, all the way down there. And because of RESTful Synths and all the libraries that we're building to support this, it's mapping this into localized exceptions that you can work with. The last property that I want here is something called list. IEnumerable of a string, and I'm just going to call it errors. Okay, and this guy is going to be a little bit interesting because when this guy is required to be rendered, I wanted to go check for this validation data first. So instead, unlike anything I've ever done before, I'm going to open up this guy a little bit like this, and I'm going to go say, wait a second, on the get, I want you to go and actually get by, because that's the event, that's the trigger that I care about. So here's this guy like this, and I'm going to go here and say, okay, this is a get, this is a set. And then in the get, I'm going to go and say, okay, my errors is going to return this .validation data if it's not null, because sometimes it's going to be null, right? And then I'm going to pass in the key in here. And out of that key, I'm going to map it to an IEnumerable of a string. So let me zoom out a little bit so you can see this. So I'm saying if this guy is not null, go ahead and map it to IEnumerable string, to that key. Find by that key and then map to IEnumerable string. Otherwise, then just go ahead and say, well, errors equal the value. So errors here equal value. Because you're just sitting things. That's it. It's just as simple as that. Well, not quite. There's one more thing that we need to do. Well, if I already have all these errors in here, why don't I wait? What is this guy asking for? Use expression body for exit. Oh, sure. Beautiful. I love it. Yeah, let's do that. Nice. Let's do that. Much cleaner. I love it. Beautiful C#. Okay. What else? You see, when you see these three dots, it's basically trying to teach you something. And now it wants to go back. Anyway, no, I love this a lot more. Okay, so you have this. I learned something. Again, every time I try to record that video, I learn something. Here's another thing that I just learned. Okay, so you can do like a fat arrow kind of functional thing. Okay, so you have this guy. Now let's render that data. Let's use this nice library called Pretty Blazor. Pretty Blazor helps you kind of build unobtrusive code, so you don't have to write C# code in the tagging. It's all just markup. It's all tags, right? So I can go here and say condition, right? Evaluation. What is the evaluation that I care about here? If these errors is not null, should be R, not null, but see the C# coder in my head, is making me do scopes and stuff. Okay, so this is a condition, and inside that condition, if it's a match, if we're good with that condition, let's go ahead and iterate. So iterations with a items that are the errors and a context that is just an error. These are all just strings, right? So we can basically go here and say inside these iterations, just go ahead and print a list item. Let's do a list item in here, and this list item will have the error in here. So this is the error that you're printing out. So we're iterating on the errors that are coming all the way from the API to print those out as a report. Okay, that means that if we have a match, I probably need to put in an unordered list. This is just a start. It's not our end product. I'm probably going to make it look a lot better than that, but an ordered list is fine for now. That's it. That's my component here. So I basically went and said, check if these errors are not null, iterate, print out these errors. This is my validation summary base. Let's submit that guy. Let's say bases and then validation summary. And let's go and merge that guy in. So let's create this guy real quick. Here we go, validation summary. And then I can merge this guy because I'm the boss. I can do that. Okay, cool. So that guy's merged. Cool. Let's go back to our system here, and let's sync up with master, and let's move on to the next thing. For starters, I just want to show you how it works, so you understand how things work, and then we're going to test drive this. I'm going to show you a prototype, and then we're going to destroy everything, and then we're going to test drive all of it. Okay, what am I trying to do here? I want to go into my student registration component here. This is my UI. And I want to go here and say, well, if student identity is not good, go ahead and add a validation summary base. And this validation summary base will care about this key. And the key is, you can be cute and go and say, well, I want to just go like this and say name of student view dot identity or something. You could do that, or you could just write it in. It's up to you. I'll let you kind of decide that. The benefit of this one is that if you change the property name, it will change it across the board wherever it's being used. So whatever makes sense to you, whatever is cleaner to you, okay? The other thing here is just it needs the validation data. So each and every one of those wants the validation data. And I'm going to go here and just type in validation data for now. So where's this validation data coming from? It's going to come from whatever exception that occurred. Let me see if I can clean this. Control KD. Hold on, this is really ugly. Control KD. There you go. Okay, two liners, give it a new line, we're good. Okay, so what needs to happen here? When an issue happens in the student identity, like this guy's going to freak out. This guy's going to print out that error, say something bad happened. So now it's not just that, oh, invalid student error occurred, please contact support or try again. No, I'm going to tell you exactly where the problem is. All right, let's go and try this out. In here, I'm going to create a new property on this guy. So it says public iDictionary, like this. It doesn't know what an iDictionary is, or do I not know how to spell it? Dictionary. Come on, there you go. And I'm going to call this my validation data. Where's this validation data coming from? When an exception occurs, a dependency validation exception, for instance, I can just go here and say this dot validation data equal dependency validation exception dot inner exception dot data. So when that happens, this error should render upstream on the UI. Is it really? Let's try it. Let's take a look. Let's see if that actually what happens. Here we go. I don't know if I need to run my API. Probably need to run my API. But you know that the local validations will catch it first. If I click submit like this, invalid student. Hold on there. Let's see. Did I miss something? Let's see. Validation summary base key identity number. Validation data. Let's see. Base, validation summary base. You're taking in the errors. If the errors is not null, that's right. Validation data with the key as IEnumerable. And the errors equals a value. Yeah, this is all good. And then in here, oh, because, why is that? Because, okay, let's see if this exception actually happens first. Let's run here. Let's see if we're actually hitting the right place. Here we go. And then submit. Yep, so this validation data here is good. It should have a results view, and this results view will have identity number, and it will have a value here called value is required. That's right. but it's not showing that in here. Let's find out why. Validation data, validation summary base, identity number. Here's your validation data. Okay, let's go to the base component and let's see if we're getting the right stuff. Let's run this again. And okay, so it's blocking this because it's trying to load. Couldn't find anything. And it couldn't find anything. Okay, back to this page. If I submit like this, the exception happened. And this guy has not been called. Has not been called. Okay, let's see. Oh, I need to do state has changed. That's right. Shame on me. Okay, let's go back here. And in this submission, I'm just going to go here and say state has changed because it didn't refresh the page, right? It didn't try to render the page silently, so it didn't actually catch whatever happened there. So let's try this again. Almost sure it's going to work this time. Let me remove the breakpoint. Only 99% sure it's going to work this time. So let's take this guy out. If I go and submit this guy, it will say, oh, there's an exception. And here's value is required. Do you see that guy right here? Of course, we need to make it in red and all that kind of stuff, but you see the point, right? So now I am getting exceptions. It's not pretty yet, but it actually works, right? But this exception, this issue that's coming in here, it's coming from the local server, from the Blazor client, right? So let me just apply this across the board so you can see how everything looks like first. So I'm just going to go here and say, give me this guy across the board. So from here to here like this, everywhere I want to print this guy. So here's your first name, summary, first name like this. Let's add this guy also. Here's your middle name. I don't think we have any validation on middle name, but you know, if you're designing a UI component, that's none of your business whether there's already validations on this level or not. All that you should care about is the fact that, you know, every field needs to correspond to a validation summary base, and that's it. So Control V here, it will give me the previous things that I copied, and this is gender for you right here, and then the last one is the date of birth. The date of birth is going to be the interesting one because I'm going to make another point for you here that you're going to love to learn about. So this is birth date. Okay. My assumption here is that, well, while we're at it, let's just make this guy red first. So this guy, I don't know, let's go here and say style, and let's say color red, something like that. I think you could do that on the list item. I don't know, we'll see. Maybe we need to add a label or something that would change the color there. Okay. All right, so we're going to do the same thing. I'm going to try and submit like this, but now this time, look, you're getting all these kind of different errors, right? The date validation happened, the value validation, the gender was okay, the last name, no validation, the middle name, no validation. So these are the issues that happened in your system, and these are all the errors that are related to that. But these errors that you're seeing here are not the errors that are coming all the way from the API, right? These are errors that are coming from your local, you know, your local validation system. Like your local system is doing this, what we call structural validation, right? Okay, what happens if I kick that off a little bit further to the API? So I'm going to go and disable my local validations in here. So on the student service level, in here, there's validate student, right? So I'm going to take that guy out, and I'm actually going to run the API. So there's my API. I think I stopped it. There it is. Let me remove that breakpoint. I'm not going to add any fields, and I'm going to show you how this validation is going to travel through the API, and then I'm going to explain to you a little bit, a couple of more concepts around that. So I'm disabling the validation on the portal, and I'm letting the API handle all that validation for me. Okay, let's run the portal again. So API is running. Let's go ahead and run the portal. Here we go. Here's the portal. And this time it's actually going to try to hit the API. So it's going all the way to the API. See that little delay is because it's actually calling the API. See, the exact same issues are coming from the API. Text is required, data is required. Actually, more assurance. I guess in the client side, I said value is required. Should be text or something like that. Should be value, if it's an identity. So this is traveling all the way from the API. Some people now, here's where it comes very interesting point. Some people will say, well, why don't you just leave all your validations? So here's just to help people understand. Some people might go and say, well, if you have a UI like this, and you have an API like this, why are you making the validation rules travel? Why don't you just, here's some school of thought, will say, let's put all our validation rules here on the client. Right? Let's put our validation rules here. What's the problem with that? The problem with that is, other than structural validations, the things that you can actually check universally that the name should not be empty, null, or white space, if you put what I call logical validations and external validations, first of all, you don't have access to the external resource. So you don't know if the item actually does exist in the database or not. So you don't have that kind of access, number one. Number two is that what if you have multiple clients? Like let's say this is a web application and this is a mobile application. Are you going to go and copy the validation rules across the board? The exact same validation, does it make sense? Does it make sense to have your validation rules copied across the board in two different systems like this? That doesn't sound right, especially if you're building a real system like an enterprise system. These rules can be in the thousands, literally thousands of rules. If you're doing anything serious, you're going to find thousands and thousands of rules that handle certain aspects of the business that you're working with. Okay? So it makes more sense to put your validation rules right here. Right? Now, some people will go and say, well, why don't you just keep all your validation rules here and not put any validation rules here? That's also wrong. Why? Because if you are certain 100,000% of certain rules that will never change, like structural validations, like numbers, like age should not be default, or date should not be default, or a name should not be null, empty, or white space, then it makes sense that you put structural validations in here before you have to pay the price for sending the request over to your API. It'll also protect you. Like this is a built-in security. It will protect you from people who are trying to spam your website and trying to break your API and DDoS your system. It'll just one line of defense that will say, if this guy is spamming your system, put your structural validation, say if the data is coming in is garbage and it's not structurally valid, go ahead and just deny it. Okay, so now we have rules here and rules here. But in here, you have three different types. You have structural, you have logical validation, and you have external validation. And now I'm going to show you this in action. I'm going to show you like if the date of birth is below a certain age, it's going to go and throw an exception and say date is out of range. We're going to add a quick rule on the API so you can see it transcend all the way from the API all the way up to your UI through an n-tier architecture, which is what the standard is, in a way, flavor of an n-tier architecture that actually allows you to kind of transcend that information all the way upstream, all the way to your UI. In a test-driven matter, it's all test-driven, it's all validated and all that kind of stuff. Let's go back here. Let's jump back to our API, and I'm going to add a quick logical validation rule in here. We haven't really visited that much in terms of the here, register student, and then student registration. This should be add student. We'll do a code drop for it later. Okay, let's do this. I'm going to go here and say, well, I'm going to create a new rule. Private dynamic is date out of range. Is birth date out of range. So this is a special business rule. When it comes to business rules, you have to be really specific, right? So this is birth date. And this guy, here's a new rule for me here. And this rule basically will say, well, if the incoming condition equals, if birth date, I don't know, subtract date time now, date time offset.utc now or something like this. Dot days is, I guess, you know, if the birth date is in the past and you're subtracting the today from it, it's going to be a negative value, I think. That's right. Right? So if this guy is less than 0, then go ahead and declare this as a failure, right? And then I'm going to add a message here on the API, and this message will say here birth date is out of range. So this is a business rule, not a structural validation rule. This is a business rule specific to a particular property. That's okay. You can add that in there. Let's go ahead and add that. Since it's not circuit breaker, we can go here and add this guy here, and then we can go and say is birth date out of range, and that's it. That's as far as I can go. Just a bunch of rules, and I just added a new rule. That's it. Ideally, of course, you need to write a failing test. This is really important. This is just the prototype aspect of this session. There will be another session where we actually test drive this and show you how to do it end to end. Okay. Now let's run our API again. And this time I'm going to show you how we can actually pull that validation rule all the way down to the UI, or whatever client you're using, really. Okay, so the API is running. That's great. Let's go into our UI here, and let's submit again. Look at this. So this is a completely external source that communicated all the errors related to that birth date. So here the date is required, birth date is out of range, and all that kind of good stuff. Does that make sense? So that's basically just the end-to-end quick run-through of communicating this. But how are we going to test drive this? How are we going to build this in a standardized way, you know, to make this test-driven, make this something that if anyone changes anything in your system, you need to capture that. That's what we're going to be discussing in the next session. It's really, really important that you have a lot of control over, you know, the data that's going back and forth between your systems, right? Especially when it comes to distributed systems and microservices architecture, you know, things that you don't necessarily own the implementation of. Like if you're calling an external resource and they're properly implemented and they're giving you back an actual error details through the API, you want to allow transcending that data all the way up to your UI. If you don't trust this external resource with their validation data, you can always manipulate that data because you have the dictionary in hand. You can do whatever you want with it, right? But more importantly, you know, building the happy path in any system, anybody can do that. Anybody can go and build your end-to-end system, no problem there. But it's the error handling and the exception handling and the communication in all different cases. That's where engineering lives. So you have to always, when you're building, when you're clicking a button and the button is doing something, that's great. But everybody could do that. The real engineering comes in where the edge cases happen and the errors happen. How are you handling, how is your system handling this situation? There will also be, you know, a little bit of conversation, and I'm gonna post in the next year, you know, I'm gonna post some videos around, you know, rolling back and rules around, you know, duplex validations. Our engineering standard is gonna continue to grow exponentially, and the more we grow and the more we interact with more people, you know, the more our system continues to evolve, right? There's a lot of people that have raised a lot of good concerns and good ideas about evolving the engineering standard, and I can't wait to share that with you. Additionally, I might also create a session before the end of the year that talks about the lake house pattern, which is the standard 3.0, you know, just an idea that I've been kind of working on and, you know, sharing with some of my close friends and, you know, getting their feedback on. So we'll make sure we talk about that as well. I hope you found this session useful. I hope you found this in any way, shape, or form something that kind of opens your eyes, opens your mind to something that you're probably working on a daily basis and you need to consider in your system. And as usual, if you have any questions, comments, or concerns, feel free to drop a comment in the comment section. I'll make sure we continue that session, you know, and we finish this up so we can commit it to the master branch. And as usual, don't forget to like and subscribe. Thank you so much for watching. I'll see you later.